bought by individuals from the wider field of Egyptology during the 19th century. But to a start, I will give you a small insight into the life of some earlier slaves in Europe, who can be seen for one or the other reasons as a kind of role model for those who followed. Already in the 18th century, people of color were quite familiar sights in the aristocratic circles from the Habsburg Empire to the Baltic Sea. Some came from nowadays Ghana, where the colony Groß-Friedrichsburg was established by mandate of Frederick Wilhelm Elector of Brandenburg in the end of the 17th century. It became known as the Brandenburg Gold Coast and supplied ivory, gold, and slaves. Others were spoils of war from the so-called Türkenkriege, or wars against the Ottomans from the 15th to the 18th century. They became known as Kammermohren, chamber moors. As such, they served not only as the visible proof that their master had far-reaching connections, but also often received a good education, as they worked in the innermost circle. The Meissen porcelain, designed by Johann Joachim Kendler, depict them in what was considered typical context, grooming horses and serving coffee or hot chocolate. The variety alone you see here shows you how popular these figurines were. Besides men, also women were part of the booty. It is said that sometime after 1683, Margrave Ludwig Wilhelm von Baden-Baden, who was known as Türkenbui, because the victory over the Turks, allegedly brought 4 wives of a pasha to Germany. At least this is what the French writer Alexandre Dumas wrote more than 100 years later in his excursions at the River Rhine. I quote, "A third room houses an equally rare curiosity, 4 life-size portraits of the Pasha's 4 wives, whom the victor had brought to Rastatt as prisoners. Here you can see 2 of them, and they do not look very much exotic or oriental. This does not necessarily mean that they were not part of the booty, as the Ottomans were constantly supplied with light-skinned women for their seraglios, not least by the raids of the Crimean Tatars in what is now Ukraine." Alexandre Dumas also relates that this part of the spoils of war was the least welcome to the Margravine, and she was not the only wife who was disappointed with her husband, as we will see later. Some of these former slave women made remarkable careers, rising to the status of mistress or even empress. For example, Roxelana, who became the wife of Suleiman I, or Fatima Maria Aurora von Spiegel, mistress of August the Strong, king of Saxony and Poland. However, the men also had the chance to rise in ranks, even if not as high as the women. One of the most famous people of color in Austria, for example, was probably a man known as Angelus Soliman. He was born around 1721 as Mahdi Makem, probably in or around nowadays Nigeria. When around 10 years old, he became the property of a rich lady in Messina, Sicily. With her, he learned Italian and Latin. Here he also got his name, Angelo Soliman. A few years later, she gave him, it is said only after several requests, as a gift to the Austrian field marshal and military governor of Messina, Duke Lobkowitz. Almost 20 years, Soliman accompanied the Duke and survived several wars and battles with him. After the death of Lobkowitz, Soliman became, by will and testament of Lobkowitz, part of Duke Wenzel von Liechtenstein's entourage, where he also got acquainted with the Austrian Emperor, Joseph II. In this time, Soliman learned 4 more European languages, German, French, English, and Czech, and was promoted to head of the service. He was known to be an extraordinarily good card player. He allegedly won 20,000 guilders, which is $500,000 of today's money in Germany, in a single card game. When he used the money to marry in 1768 without consulting his employee, he shortly fell into disgrace. After Wenzel von Liechtenstein's death, Soliman served under his successor as tutor to his son and heir. In 1781, he was admitted to the Viennese Masonic Lodge zur wahren Eintracht, True Harmony, of which Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Joseph Haydn but were also members. In his book, The Magical Flute, Opera and Mystery, Jan Assmann surmises that the character of Monostatos in Mozart's opera was based on Angelo Soliman. Unlike Monostatos, who was quite unsympathetic, Angelo was extremely popular in Vienna. He died in 1796, but more on that in the end of my talk. He's only one of several known people of color at European courts during that time. I just introduce him as Pars pro toto to show you that the possession of a colored person was fashionable, but more or less limited to high nobility. This changed fundamentally at the end of the 18th century, starting with Napoleon's expedition to Egypt, when a lot of European residents and travelers took slaves into their households. One of the early accounts of a traveler buying a slave is by the famous Swiss Johann Ludwig Burckhardt. In 1814, he visited the slave market in Shenzi, where around 5,000 slaves were traded annually, 80% of them women. In Ottoman Egypt, women from Abyssinia, what is nowadays Ethiopia, and especially from a part called Oromia, were in favor, not only because of their light skin, but also because they, according to Burckhardt, are distinguished above all other blacks by their beauty, their strength, and the constancy of their affection for their master, once he has taught them love for himself. However, Burckhardt purchased the boy. The reason is also given in his travel account. With the rest of my fortune, I bought myself a slave boy. On the one hand, I wanted to have a useful and constant companion, and on the other, it gave me a plausible excuse for traveling to the Red Sea, as I could sell him there for a profit. And this is exactly what he did a few weeks later. It was common in those days to buy and sell slaves according to particular needs. A slave whose performance did not match with the expectation was sold as easily as a servant was sacked. The slave being, even if this sounds quite rude, sometimes even in a better position than a servant, as his master was responsible for accommodation and alimentation, at least as long as he or she was a slave. In fact, when slavery started to be abolished in Egypt in the end of the 19th century, it became a problem for former female slaves to find a new position, especially when they had a darker skin. And a lot of dark-skinned slaves were brought to Egypt from 1820 on with the invasion of the Sudan by the Egyptian army. The campaign amounted to one of the largest slave raids ever, as the Pasha created a new army by African slaves. In the years to follow, the new soldiers had to go back to their home country during the annual Gazuas, military expeditions to gather new slaves and recruits. An estimated 50,000 were killed during these raids alone. Between 1821 and 1825, around 80,000 were sent north, but not all of them arrived. In general, one can say that only 1 out of 8 slaves captured by the Egyptian forces reached Egypt. As much as the influx of people of color increased under Muhammad Ali Pasha's rule, the number of Europeans increased as well. Some of them took female slaves, who rose to the rank of wives. One of the better known was probably the chief physician of the Pasha's army, Dr. Charles Dussac. He had 2 children with his wife Halima, but he never manumitted her. Until her death, she remained a slave wife. And besides Halima, at least 6 other slaves lived in Dr. Dussac's household, male and female. Another famous slaveholder was the French Colonel Joseph Antoine Sèvres, better known as Soliman Pasha at Mansouri, who was responsible for the reorganization of the Pasha's army. Like many other French soldiers who came to Egypt in the wake of Napoleon's expedition, he embraced the Muslim faith when he joined the service of the Pasha. He took an Arabic name and enjoyed the Ottoman lifestyle, including a harem. When leading the Pasha's army to Greece, he acquired 3 girls, one of which, Maria Hanem, captured his heart and caused some dispute with his former favorite, a black woman called Azana, who was sent away in consequence. Soliman had 4 children with Hanem. The granddaughter of his daughter Nazmi who was also named Nasri, became the Queen of Egypt when she married King Fuad. With the help of these men and many more Europeans and Americans, Muhammad Ali Pasha not only modernized Egypt, but made it a safe destination for an ever-increasing number of travelers and explorers. Quite a lot of them also purchased slaves. There were several reasons for such a purchase. Boys were chosen as travel companions or servants, as in Burkhart's case, or out of scientific or missionary interest. There were also reasons to buy a girl, which were not driven by sexual interest, but more often related to it. Last but not least, some purchases, male or female, were driven by compassion, to save the slaves from the hands of the jalabas or slave traders. And there are many descriptions of the poor condition of the slaves and the sufferings they had to endure. Females had to work immediately for their captors, grinding grain, preparing food, carrying water, doing the laundry, and serve as concubines or even prostitutes. The jalabas were especially interested in selling their service to Europeans. They even got a discount, as the slave traders hoped that the girl became pregnant and would deliver a fair-skinned baby, which could be sold as an Abyssinian mulatto, the preferred slaves in Egypt. But now to the travels. In 1821, Heinrich Menü, Freiherr von Minutuli, had a scientific expedition in Egypt on behalf of the Russian government. A painting shows Minutuli and his entourage in front of the ruins of Shali in the oasis of Siwa. On the left side of the tent, a black boy can be seen, who, by comparison to other depictions, seems to be a slave. And Minutuli's wife, Wolferdine, wrote in her travel account, Europeans, who dare not keep white slaves in Egypt, have now gained the right to buy black ones. Therefore, all families resident in Cairo have the same. We ourselves bought a boy who we take with us to Europe and who has the best traits. There always was a hint that the boy could have ended as a household member of Prince Karl of Prussia. A painting by the artist Konstantin Schröter from 1823, which is only 2 years after the purchase of the Minutulis, shows a colored boy. The painting was until recently known as the Blackamoor Ahmed, with English Newfoundland dogs in front of the gates of the Crown Prince's palace. The palace was the home of Prince Karl during that time, and Heinrich von Minutuli was for years the prince's tutor. It was quite common that slaves were consigned to sovereigns or other members of the ruling dynasty, especially when they were bought by explorers or members of scientific expeditions, if only to avoid further expenses. The figure of the youth clearly shows a resemblance to the boy next to the tent of Minutuli. Only recently, a letter by Minutuli to Prince Karl was published, which makes it clear that Minutuli has indeed given his slave to the prince. Minutuli wrote, Kairallah, who will soon be able to become secretary, I kindly ask you to say a tayin sabah khair salamat from me. Thus we know the slave name of the boy, Kairallah. He was baptized in April 1828 as Heinrich Karl Albrecht Kerala, taking the names of Heinrich von Minutuli and Prince Karl, who acted as his godfathers. From the corresponding entry in the church register, we even learn his birth name, as it reads, the blackamoor of His Royal Highness Prince Karl, who was raised as a Muslim, was ordered to use besides his Christian names the name Kerala as his surname, instead of his given name Kanda. However, at least concerning the painting, the boy lost all his names again, as it is now known as Black Servant with the dogs of Prince Karl of Prussia at the Palais of the Princesses. At least 6 more people of color are known in the entourage of the Prussian dynasty in the years thereafter. One of them is depicted in another painting by Franz Krüger. You can already see that paintings are a good source to learn more about people of color in aristocratic circles. On the painting, which is called Parade unter den Linden, a boy can be seen, who is wearing a red face. As the artwork was painted only in 1839, it probably shows a 14-year-old boy known as Ahmed Kerala. He was bought by a man named Schropp, who can be identified as Leopold Schropp, son of Simon Schropp, a merchant in maps since 1742, and the shop can still be found in Berlin. Leopold traveled in Egypt and the Sudan around 1835. It is known that he bought a child of color during his trip to Nubia. On one of Leopold's remaining sketches, a small boy can be seen in the ruins of Karnak Temple. Whether it is Ahmed Ferrara cannot be proven, but has some probability. From an article in a newspaper in Munich, where Schrock made a stopover on his way back to Berlin, we learn about the boy's place of origin. The article reads, "It is this traveler, Mr. Leopold Schrock, whose beautiful specimen of an 11-year-old blackamoor from Senna that he brought with him will have been seen with delight by the inhabitants of Munich for several weeks." In Berlin, the boy became a member of the entourage of Prince Wilhelm. He was baptized in 1839 as Alexander Anastasius Ahmed Ferrara. Like many other people of color in Europe during that time, Ferrara died of tuberculosis in 1843. Some years before that, on the 1st of January 1837, Prince Hermann Muskau landed in Alexandria. At the slave market in Cairo, Pückler purchased a 10-year-old Abyssinian girl by the name of Ayari, who became his travel companion. He wrote, "When I bought her, and for fear that someone else might beat me to it, I had the asking price paid immediately, without any bargaining." Further slaves were bought in Khartoum and Wadmarani by Pückler, as well as by his secretary Ackermann, his dragoman, and his cook. While his employees only bought girls for their entertainment, Pückler bought at least 2 girls and a boy named Amandé. The boy was allegedly a son of a chieftain, whom Pückler bought to set free, like all his slaves. However, they all had to travel according to his demand. Pückler took the boy, the newly acquired boy, and the 2 girls with him when he started his return to Germany. He left one of the girls, Aisha, as a gift for Lady Hester Stanhope in Wilbraham. The other girl and the boy went on with him to Moscow, where Amandé, who was baptized. In 1844 as August Paulo Yoladua, so we know probably now his birth name, Yoladua. The girl, 12 to 13 years old Oromia, at the time of the purchase, was to become the talk of the town in Vienna and Berlin, although Pückler seemed not to have had much interest in her in the beginning. According to latest research, it was only after his beloved Ayane died of tuberculosis, then still in Egypt, that Billy, better known as Mahbuba, became the apple of his eye. To avoid gossip, Pückler called her his foster daughter. In Vienna, he introduced her to members of the high society, amongst others Fürst Metternich. Pückler first planned to put her in a boarding school for girls in Vienna, but soon decided to take her with him to Moscow, much to the distress of Pückler's divorced wife Lucy, with whom he still shared his life and residence in Germany. When Pückler and Mahbuba arrived in Moscow in September 1840, Lucy soon fled to Berlin and expected her husband to follow her. Leaving the girl, who showed signs of very ill health, Pückler traveled to Berlin, where the news of Mahbuba's death of tuberculosis reached him only a few weeks later. At the same time as Pückler Moscow, Duke Maximilian in Bavaria visited Egypt on occasion of his pilgrimage to the Holy Land. At the slave market in Alexandria, which he visited soon after his arrival, he was, so to speak, only window shopping. But in Cairo, he bought already 4 boys. And you see here their birth name, their slave name, and their Christian name, as well as their age. The boys were between 9 and 13 years of age. They came from different parts of what is nowadays Sudan and Ethiopia. On their onward journey, a 5th boy, probably from Nubia, completed the lot. Although it is maybe hard to imagine, we should not forget that these boys probably could not communicate with each other, but in the few words of Arabic they might have learned after their capture, as they all originated from different parts of the country and continent. The region of their origin was known as Land of the Infidels. It spans from the Horn of Africa in the east to Lake Chad in the west. As infidels, they were fair game for the Muslim slave traders. A Muslim could not be enslaved by a Muslim. However, embracing Islam later did not change the status of a slave. And as it was common practice that all slaves became Muslims latest after their arrival in Cairo, it was not allowed for Christians to purchase female slaves. However, we will see that there were loopholes that could and have been used. In the case of Duke Max in Bavaria, all 5 slave boys accompanied him on his way back home. In Munich, 4 of the boys lived in the palace of the Duke, where they for sure met his children, one of which was Elizabeth, the later Empress of Austria. Shortly after their arrival in Bavaria, the boys were baptized in March 1839 at the Münchner Frauenkirche. A painting from 1841 by the German artist Ludwig Emil Grimm features the baptism of a blackamoor. Although the painting was executed only shortly after 1839, it seems not to depict the very occasion, as the ceremony in Munich was executed by Domkapitular Balthasar Speth, whom Grimm knew very well, and not by the bishop, as depicted by the artist. While living in Munich, the boys were educated by the German linguist Karl Tuchek, who used the opportunity to compile a dictionary and grammar of the Oromo or Gala language. In this groundbreaking work, also Principal Muscos Pilile had a part. To highlight her contribution, however, we first have to follow the footsteps of another slave. In 1840, Prince Friedrich Paul Wilhelm of Württemberg, who was more famous for his explorations in America, visited the slave market in Khartoum, where he bought an Oromo boy named Aman Gonda. He accompanied the prince back to his residency in Mergentheim, where he was baptized as Karl Aman Habash. On instigation of the Duke, Karl Habash worked together with Karl Tuchek on the said dictionary. On their way back from Egypt to Mergentheim, Karl had met Pückler and Bilile en route. As both kids were homesick, Bilile had recited for him some songs from their home country. These songs now fought their way into Tuchek's dictionary. While more or less all these slaves were bought at slave markets, Prince Albrecht of Prussia got one in 1843 as a gift, of whom is yet a matter of dispute. The boy is depicted in several times in the Prince's Travelogue, Album der Orientalischen Reise, but it's still unknown where he joined the group of travelers. We only know that it must have happened before they reached Aswan, where he was first depicted. The second sketch you see here is, by the way, in Khan Yusuf, in the Gaza Strip. When the travelers visited the German archaeologist Richard Lepsus and his party in April 1843 at the pyramids, Lepsus' architect, Georg Erkam, wrote in his diary, 2 servants and 1 cook followed the prince, as well as a small black boy, whom the prince got as a gift from the governor of South. The word used in German is Oberhalb, which means somewhere above, which is south of Cairo. The word, according to the register of the family, which the former slave later founded in Berlin, he was a gift of Muhammad Ali Pasha, Egypt's viceroy. However, this cannot be verified. Also not verified can be his supposed lineage from a noble family, a claim, by the way, ushered by almost every slave acquired by Europeans. The birth name of the boy, who probably originated from Kordofan and who was around 8 years old when he joined the prince, is unknown. The Prussians called him Saba Alkhair, probably his slave name given by the Jalabas. In Germany, Saba Alkhair was baptized as August Albrecht Saba Alkhair. He spent quite a happy life, at least as much as we can assume by the known facts, and if we are allowed to assume and judge at all. For a time he accompanied the prince as his wife. We see him here together with the prince in his study. Right? Maria Jung, Anna Maria Jung. The couple got 2 children. His son, Gustav Saba Alkhair, followed a career as musician in the Prussian army. The whole story of the family is known today because 2 scholars endeavored a painting in the Historic Museum of Berlin entitled A Prussian Love. Their curiosity drove them to find out more about the depicted persons, which we now know Augusta Saba-Alfer, and his wife Gertrude. Hardly a year after Prince Albrecht and his slave visited Richard Lepsius at the pyramids, also the man who is considered as father of German Egyptology came into the possession of a slave. We see him here sitting behind Lepsius on a camel. At the time, Lepsius and Pastor Abeken, a member of his expedition, were traveling the shores of the Blue Nile. On occasion of a visit to Sultan Nasr, the noble woman wanted to provide him with a slave girl, which Lepsius rejected as, according to his own words, it was against the German customs. One has to remember this was only shortly after Prince Hitler Muskau had aroused not only his former wife's anger, when he had brought his slave Billy to Moscow. The Sultana rather found Lepsius' suggestion to accept the boy instead dubious. However, she sent him one. According to the boy's own account, his name was Gabriel Mariam, and that he belonged to a noble family from Gondar, capital of the kingdom of Amhara. He was about 8 years old when he joined Lepsius. However, Gabriel Mariam was not the only slave Lepsius and Abeken brought back from their excursion to the Blue Nile. When they rejoined the rest of their group, Georg Erbkamp wrote in his diary, they had been 2 days above from Senna. Their fauna and flora changes remarkably. They brought different species from there, as well as 2 slaves. One belonged to Lepsius and another to Abeken. And Max Weidenbach, another member of the expedition, relates that the boy was called Abdallah, and that he was not a gift, but acquired for 650 piastres. Both of them are depicted on the commemoration stela on occasion of Richard Lepsius' birthday in December 1844. Gabriel Mariam is standing beside Lepsius, while Abdallah is sitting underneath Abeken. Whether Abdallah accompanied Abeken to Germany is not known yet. If so, he would probably have been trained as a missionary to finally return to his home country. At least this was Lepsius' plan for Gabriel Mariam. But in Germany, not everything went as planned. A recurring element, as we will see. An entry in the diary of Richard Lepsius' wife Elizabeth from March 12, 1848, gives a small insight in the problems Lepsius was facing with a then 12-year-old boy. I quote, "The black boy Richard got from the Nubian princess as a gift is educated on behalf of the king and shall later return as a missionary to his hometown. However, now already the second teacher complains about him and does not want to teach him anymore. He is a burden to himself and to anybody else. The best would be to send him home." John Gardner Wilkinson, a long-time resident in Egypt, of whom we shall hear later more, warned travelers to take slaves to Europe. He wrote, "I particularly advise travelers never to bring back boys to Europe as servants. They are always discontented, pine to go back to Egypt, and give great troubles." In Lepsius' case, it took another 5 years, until February 1853, that the decision was finally taken to send Gabriel Mariam home, probably after his education was more or less completed. The corresponding entry in Elizabeth Lepsius' diary reads, "Consul Weber, who is on his way to Beirut, said his farewell. He will take Gabriel Mariam with him, because he does not carry at all. He shall return to his home, first to Bishop Robert in Jerusalem, who always has connections to Abyssinia. A stone has been lifted from my heart." It seems that Gabriel Mariam reached his home country under the custody of Bishop Robert, but thereafter we lose his track. Only 1 month after Lepsius freed himself from the responsibility for his former slave, acquaintances of him, Frau Schlieffen and his mother, Sophie, acquired 2 boys in Khartoum in March 1853. They paid 600 piastres for the 8-year-old Khairallah from Wat Marani at the Blue Nile. Allegedly, Khairallah was an orphan and his parents murdered. The second boy was from Darfur, but the very next day they discovered that he was suffering from smallpox, a disease regularly found amongst slaves. As a consequence, they exchanged him against a 5-year-old boy from the Nuba Mountains by the name Niangul. Exchanging slaves within a short period of time was common practice. One did not even have to give a reason why. During the expedition, the two boys served Count and Countess Schlieffen as servants. But the Countess also gave them German lessons, as it was planned to take them to Germany. And so it happened. As was quite usual in these cases, the boys were given into the custody of a parson, who looked after their education. 6 years after their arrival in Germany, they were baptized on February 16, 1859, at their parson's home in Torgau, Saxony. Herr Allah became Johannes Wilhelm, and Niangul Wilhelm Johannes. After the baptism, they were separated for the first time after their purchase. Wilhelm Johannes Niangul went with Count Schlieffen to Schlieffenberg in Mecklenburg, Western Pomerania, where he received confirmation in March 1863. Some years later, he married Bertha Köpke, daughter of the Grand Duke of Mecklenburg's cupbearer at Ludwigslust Council. In 1881, their daughter Mathilde Amelia Louise was born. The registry of her birth is the last time we hear of Niangul. Johannes Wilhelm Herr Allah remained with Countess Schlieffen. He is mentioned in the census from 1867 in Güstrow, also Mecklenburg, West Pomerania, where the Countess lived after the marriage of her son. Herr Allah is said to have been the foster child and servant of the Countess. After her death, he moved to Schlieffenberg. He also is last mentioned 1881 on occasion of the baptism of Niangul's daughter, for whom he served as godfather. After that, his trail is also lost. However, a painting that came up in the art market in Germany some time ago might give us his portrait. The painting seems to be a commissioned work. Depicted as a young man in the costume of a travel monk. In the background, the island of Philae can be recognized. At the bottom left, the name Herr Allah can be read. There's neither signature nor date, which is rather common for commissioned works. However, on the back side are several notes on the frame by a different hand. On top is written Lega Koralla, at the bottom Maler Schlöpke Schwerin, and on the right frame Deck von Graf Schlieb, Eltern ermordet, acquired by Count Schlieb, parents murdered. Exactly what presumably happened to the parents of Schlieffen's boy, Johannes Wilhelm Herr Allah. For the artist, one tends to think of Theodor Schlöpke, court painter of the Grand Duke of Mecklenburg. However, Schlöpke died already in 1878 at a time when Herr Allah was known to spend at least some time in Schlieffenberg. So the painting was probably not executed in Egypt. It is not known who left the notes on the frame. Whether the depicted is really Johannes Wilhelm Herr Allah must therefore remain open. If it really is him, then he might not even have traveled to Egypt, as the motif itself was well known from earlier travelers. And it could just have been used as a background for a studio portrait. At least there's one specific relation to Egypt Schlöpke's employer, the Grand Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, and Count Schlieffen shared. Both men had visited Egypt and were in close contact with the Egyptologist Heinrich Fuchs. Fuchs, in turn, consigned his own servant, a young Nubian, to Empress Elizabeth of Hungary and Austria on occasion of the World Exhibition in Vienna, 1873. At least this is what Fuchs relates in his autobiography. According to other sources, it is said that the boy was a gift by Khedive Ismail, which one applies is hard to say, but Empress Elizabeth had already asked her husband to bring her a place, or rather a letter more, on the occasion of his trip to the opening of the Suez Canal. In a letter dated 16 November 1869, she wrote, "But I would even prefer a letter more. Perhaps you will bring me one as a surprise, for which I will kiss you very much in advance." Franz Josef did not bring her one. But as Heinrich Fuchs was the Emperor's travel guide on this occasion, he perhaps knew about the Empress's wish, which he could have fulfilled on the occasion of the World Exhibition. What is certain is a boy named Mahmoud Rustimo soon became of the youngest daughter of the Empress. For Empress Elizabeth, it must have been a reminder of her own youth to see her daughter in the company of a child of color. Rustimo was baptized as Rudolf, with Grandprince Rudolf serving as his godfather, but not Oriental. According to a later newspaper article, problems began when Ostimo reached puberty. It stated that the exotic sides of his nature became more and more unpleasant to the fore, so he was retired after 10 years. The prince's playmate was transferred to the pension institute in Yps, where he died in 1892 at the age of around 30. Quite similar was the fate of two other boys, which were brought to Germany by the two Africa explorers Gerhard Wolf and Georg Schweinfurt. When Schweinfurt visited the headquarters of the so-called Black Pasha, al-Zubair Rahman Mansur Pasha, in Darfur, who was in control of the whole slave trade from Central Africa up the Nile, he himself was owner of 3 slaves. He had a 14 or 15-year-old pygmy from the Akka tribe, whom he had exchanged against one of his dogs. The boy was called Mesero, and Schweinfurt treated him like an adopted son. Schweinfurt was longing to take him to Germany, as he wrote, as a living evidence of the truth that lay under the myth of some 1,000 years. By myth, he meant the small people who were mentioned by the writers in the antiquity. Mesere's greatest fear was that he would be eaten by his new master. As a matter of fact, this is a recurrent theme in stories about slavery. It was not only used as a potential threat by the slave traders to make their merchandise more docile, but was also a real hazard, not with European masters, but with some of their African neighbors. In order that Mesere would not feel lonely, Schweinfurt bought 2 more slaves for company. One boy was from the Asanda tribe, that were said to be cannibals, and therefore also named onomatopoetically Niam Niam, which makes one wonder whether Mesere was grateful for this specific company. The second slave was a Bongo by the name of Lebe, which is the mimosa tree. The Dinkas, who had captured him, had called him Teen, which in their language means tree, and Schweinfurt gave him the name Alagabo, the Arabic rendering of Theodore, gift of God. His whole name given by Schweinfurt was thus Alagabo too. Much to Schweinfurt's regret, Mesere died, already on the journey to Egypt. Thereupon he left the young Asande with his friend Dr. Henry Saxby in Cairo, who allegedly took the boy as a servant. However, Dr. Sachs might have had also other interests, if only ethnological, as he got the boy, whose name is said to have been Amber, photographed. Furthermore, he ordered an oil painting to show the exact color of the boy's skin. Shortly after, Amber allegedly ran away from his new master. The rest is unknown. Alado Tim accompanied Schweinfurt back to Germany, despite the fact that he still had relatives whom he and Schweinfurt had visited before their departure. According to Schweinfurt, it was the boy's own decision to leave with him to Germany. It seems that Alagabo considered himself as Schweinfurt's adopted son. Schweinfurt, for his part, took him, as he wrote to his mother, as a souvenir and reminder of things past. As soon as they reached Germany, Schweinfurt handed the boy over to his brother-in-law, Gerhard Wolf, who had a slave himself for many years. He allegedly got the boy as a present after having treated the malady of a slave trader. At first reluctant to accept the human present, Wolf took the more or less starving boy, who otherwise would probably have died. As it happened to be Christmas at the time, he named him Henri Noël. You will hear shortly a bit more about him. Rolfs recommended that Schweinfurt should give Alagabo Tim as a present, either to the German or Russian emperor, as Schweinfurt's family originated from Riga and had connections to the Tsar. However, Schweinfurt was hesitant. While he kept on traveling, he paid the expenses for Alagabo Tim's accommodation and education, as well as an apprenticeship with a bookbinder. According to Rolfs, however, Alagabo became more and more difficult when he got older. After he had broken off several training courses, there was talk of sending him back to Africa. or even further on to America. For Alagabutim, it was incomprehensible that the man who had been so generous to take him to Germany was now constantly complaining about his behavior. In 1889, Schweinfurt stopped all payments and contact. 7 years later, he only got to know by chance about the death of his former protégé, either by alcoholism or tuberculosis, depending which source one will trust. Alagabutim died when he was around 30 years old. Gerhard Wolf's former slave, Maurice, had to suffer much longer. After an odyssey from Africa to Germany, back to Egypt, and again back to Europe, he lived for 52 years in an asylum in Ancona, where he died only in 1931. As we had seen already in the case of Prince Hüttler, also female slaves were acquired by travelers. Hüttler, however, was actually an exception, as he was not living for a longer period of time in Egypt, because one of the reasons why unmated Europeans bought female slaves was that they weren't allowed to live outside the French quarters, when there was no woman in the household. As soon as there was a woman, they were able to choose where they wanted to stay. The purchase of a female slave thus combined the useful with the pleasant, so to speak. The girls and women were used to be at their master's command, as according to Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, almost all girls above the age of 10 were already abused en route by the slave traders. There was also at least one female slave in Burckhardt's house. However, nothing is known about her origins. After Burckhardt's death, she was given to a man named Osman, who was a former slave himself. Osman Effendi was born as William Thompson in Perth, Scotland. He came to Egypt with the army of General Fraser, which was defeated under great losses, and William got captured by Ottoman soldiers. Like all Christian prisoners, he had the choice between death and conversion, and chose the latter. However, not before he was enslaved, as Muslims cannot be enslaved by Muslims. Osman was freed by the combined efforts of Burckhardt and the English Consul General Henry Stott. As he remained to be a Muslim, he was able to purchase female slaves himself. It is said that he had at least 10 in his house. Most of them probably bought at the slave market in Cairo. Henry Stott, the just mentioned Consul General of England, lived also with a slave girl, with whom he had a son, before he married an Italian woman. He might have acquired her on his journey to Abyssinia, as she's depicted in his book A Voyage to Abyssinia as an Abyssinian slave. Before he married, he gave her a dowry and made her and her son over to a Muslim. Others were less considerate, as we learn again from John Gardner Wilkinson. He wrote concerning fellow Europeans, many either sell or barter their slaves, and some even sell them when pregnant, thus abandoning their own children to slavery, on the chance of whose birth they blush not to receive a premium. John Gardner Wilkinson was a slaveholder himself. He lived together with a Muslim girl. As we have heard already, all slaves had to convert to Islam by will or force, as no Muslim would accept heathens or infidels in their household. It is said that the girl chosen by Wilkinson was first reluctant to stay with him, only when he convinced her that he was a devout Muslim, although British, she agreed. A similar story, though with a different outcome, is recorded for the famous artist John Frederick Lewis, who briefly enjoyed the company of an Abyssinian girl called Husni. She allegedly left him after she discovered that he had only paper in his bathroom and no water, like any decent Muslim would have. Like Lewis, most Europeans preferred women from Abyssinia, as we have heard several times before because of their beauty, comparatively light skin and good temper. White female slaves, who were mostly of Caucasian or Georgian origin, were not to be found on the open slave markets. They were only sold behind closed doors, where Christians were forbidden to enter, and only to the Ottoman and Mameluke elite. But, as with everything that can be purchased, also the slave market was determined by supply and demand. During the Greek War of Independence in the years from 1822 to 1826, a great number of girls from Crete and the Greek mainland and islands were captured by the Ottomans and flooded the slave markets of the Ottoman Empire. Quite a lot of them came with the victorious Ottoman army to Egypt. Since Europe, and especially the British, supported the Greeks in their fight for independence, some Europeans started to buy the Greek girls to spare as many as possible from the life as a slave in a Muslim household. The purchases were handled usually by a middleman, like the before-mentioned Osman Effendi. One of the purchasers was Robert Hay of Lindland, born in Scotland. He acquired a girl named Kalitza Tsaraki, daughter of a high-ranking public servant from Upper Dulu, Crete, shortly after his arrival in Egypt in 1824. The girl had been captured by the Turks, then liberated by Greek sea rovers from the Isle of Kassos. Later, Mustafa Bey captured Kassos and took 900 women as prisoners. Amongst them was Kalitza, who was brought to Egypt, where Hay bought her at the slave market in Alexandria. Hay led an expedition from 1824 to 1834 for the study of pharaonic and Islamic monuments in Egypt, for which he employed a whole bunch of British artists. He encouraged his employees to enter into relationships with Greek slave girls, while he provided in several cases the money for their purchase and living. For example, in 1828, he gave the 8-year-old Anastasia, or Nephise, as she was known by her slave name, as a gift to Edward William Lane. Lane married her in 1840, probably on Hay's instigation. Hay had realized that buying their freedom alone would not save the girls from an unhappy existence, so he urged his employees to marry them, as he had married Kalitza 4 years after her purchase. Another of Hay's employees was James Burton. He enjoyed the company of at least 3 slave girls, an Abyssinian named Blackie, whom he acquired at the age of 12 and later provided with a dowry and married off, a second of unknown origin, and a Greek girl, Adriana Daupalaki, better known as Dudu. He bought her in December 1824 at the slave market in Cairo, in the company of Robert Hay and Osman Effendi. He married her only after their return to England, causing much annoyance to his family. She might have been one reason that Burton was disowned by his relatives. She outlived her husband for 22 years. Her only income was an allowance of £200 a year from her husband's family, provided she renounced any claim on the family estate. The late Neil Cook, who worked on Burton, wrote, "With so few details known, it is difficult to assess whether Adriana's life was better in one country or the other. Whether she would have preferred remaining in Egypt as a slave is impossible to assess. It was certainly a choice she was never offered." Also, the relationship between Burton's secretary Charles Humphreys with a certain Ahmed, who in reality was a girl by the name of Adriana Copigliani, was probably supported by Robert Hay. Joseph Bonamy enjoyed the company of a girl named Fatima, who seemed not to have any connection to Greece. He fathered 2 children, but never paid any alimony after his return to England, even when contacted by Fatima. All slave girls that lived with Europeans wore exclusively men's clothes when outside the house, and, as just mentioned, had male code names, so that they passed as young Mamelukes. It's the same garment which Bilili or Mahbuba is wearing on the only known illustration of her. However, the artist may have used the image of another former slave who had come to Europe a century before. Angelo Soliman was a well-respected citizen of Vienna, as you have heard in the beginning. However, this did not save him from an undignified fate after his death. Probably by order of the Austrian Emperor Franz II, his stuffed skin was exhibited for a decade in the Museum of Natural History in Vienna. These are the much summarized fates of only a handful of slaves. There are many more who lost their home, their relation, their religion, their language, as well as their names, when they became doomed to travel, and millions more share the same fate today on all continents. They are not as lucky as we are traveling mostly by our own choice. Thank you very much.